Hi, welcome to the LA Times. I'm Jean Gendreau, and today my special guest is Peter Malmgren, and he is the author of a book called Los Alamos Revisited. How are you today?
Great. I'm so pleased to be here. It's really exciting for me to do a little television.
Thank you for coming. So, Los Alamos Revisited is an oral history project conceived in 2000 by the Rio Arribo Environmental Health Association. Tell us how you got started with the project.
Well, I was just a volunteer there. It was a very active, small group at the college in Espanola. And as I say, I was just volunteering, and someone came up with the idea of doing an oral history of Los Alamos workers. And it was sort of stimulated by the fact that the CDC had come to town and had just begun a very exhaustive search of the document search at the laboratory. It went on for many years. They were interested in trying to unearth all the information in terms of spills and problems that had occurred at the lab in the early years. And so as they were beginning to get started, we thought, well, this is a scientific study. These people are all PhDs and experts in their fields of epidemiology and other things. Why don't we consider doing something that's a corollary story, that's a humanistic story, that would kind of balance it out a little bit? So that it just popped up as an idea at our meeting, and up my hand went, because I love oral history, and I had done some before in my own village and other places. And that led to 5 years of just the most wonderful, intense detective work and finding people in 25 different communities, including, of course, people up here, but it focused mainly on people who were commuting every day from Hispanic villages all over northern New Mexico. And it turns out, sort of in retrospect, at the time it didn't seem like it was that unique a thing to do. It ignited my curiosity and my motivation, but now, 15 years later or so, I look back and realize that the people I was able to capture on tape at that time are now mainly gone. And the opportunity to get that kind of information is really lost to us. And I think I'm pretty much the only person who took the time and the effort to be able to extract these wonderful stories from people's lives at that time. And it took me much too long to do the book, and I'm very sad to say that in trying to give honor to these people and their work and their commitment to the laboratory, that I can't do it to them directly, but I pass that honor on to their families. I have people calling sons and daughters saying, "We've heard you've written a book. I need to have it." It's turning into a wonderful thing. I'm having a book signing in Espanola at the Bond House tomorrow, and that one is a particular close to my heart, because that's the core of where all these people who I interviewed came from. So it'll be very interesting to see how many local folks I can bring out. And then coming up here the week later, I'm very curious to see who will be attracted to this kind of information that we haven't seen before. So when I got this idea to do the oral history, first thing I did is jump in the car, come up here and go to the biggest bookstore I could find, which is the one who's no longer here next to the museum, and peruse the shelves. And it was just mile after mile, I'm exaggerating, of books about the scientists, the great minds, and the great achievers of the laboratory. And I didn't find a single piece written from the perspective of people who gave their working lives to support all this effort. And they numbered in their thousands. And I thought, this is a hole in New Mexico history here that needs to be filled. So that kind of spurred me on to begin slowly the process.
So, are all these people that you did interviews, I guess you did 150 interviews,
I did.
are they all Lano employees?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, yeah, some of them were worked for Zia. They weren't all necessarily at the lab, but they were connected in one way or another. Their jobs were connected with the laboratory.
And at one point you said you tried to write a play about these workers. What happened with that?
Well, I had a girlfriend years ago who was a wonderful actress, and she came out wanting to move from California. And when she was going back, I stuck a few interviews in her bag and stuff and said, "You take a look at this stuff, And she got excited about it, and then she contacted some of her theatrical friends, and it led to this whole sort of little group that wanted to make this into a play. And it was ultimately it was too many cooks that spoiled the broth, if you know that expression. It was like I was doing all the legwork, I was handing them all my research, and they were trying to interpret it. And unfortunately, these were Californians who had just come to New Mexico, and they were having a love affair with Indian spiritualism, as is so often the case. And they wanted to sort of interject Indian spirituality in the midst of this. I don't know how to describe my work, but it's what did you do for work? How did you feel about it? Give me the details and stuff. And here they come with all this spiritual stuff on top of it, and it never really made a proper fit. So we got it as far as the Lensic for a reading, 2 nights of readings, and lots of people came, but we were never able to take it the step further to actually complete the project. So it kind of fizzled out.
Are you going to try for that again?
I hadn't really thought about it. I know it's just sort of sitting in the file drawers. What I did first was when I decided enough, I can't do any more of these, and the money was running out, I made sure that I got them all into the archives in Santa Fe, the major archives, for future protection. That was the first thing that I committed to. Then we got into this play thing, and as I say, it was ultimately kind of a disappointment that it wasn't completed. And I knew in the back of my mind that to really answer the promises that I made to some of these people who I really loved was that I was going to get their stories told somehow or other. And I knew that ultimately meant a book. And I was just I was overwhelmed by the thousands of pages of transcripts that I, had painfully transcribed over these years. Thousands of pages. How do you sift this down and distill it down into something that you can pick up in your hand, And it would not have been done if it hadn't been for my dear friend Kay Matthews, who is the co-writer of the book, who is a writer, a wonderful writer in her own right, and has great editorial skills, to agree to really kick me in the behind and finally tackle it, after really putting it away for so long. And she's the reason that we have it here. And it was a great collaboration. And I am indebted to her to really get me moving.
So you said at the end of each interview you asked the same question. What is that question?
Yeah, the question was, if you had your life to live over again, would you choose the same path that led you to your work in Los Alamos? And curiously enough, 75 people, or exactly half, said it was the great experience of my life. It provided for my family and my child's educations, and I would encourage my children, as I have in generations following, to go to the lab and continue to flourish. The other people said, I wouldn't go near Los Alamos if you couldn't pay me enough money to ever go near Los Alamos again.
Why is that?
Because people suffered all kinds of terrible health effects. People died, people were crippled by it, and they were basically saying my health was more important than a steady paycheck. So we have to get, into the book. I hope people see as a fairly balanced plus and negative as this reflects, but not to ignore the number of people who died in the process of doing their work here and the kinds of suffering that occurred.
I didn't realize that all that went on.
Yeah, and you've been here a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's important to, reveal some of this stuff because people, and it wasn't just the Spanish guys who were taking out the garbage and cleaning up spills and doing the really nasty work. A lot of the people on this list of 250 or something in the back of the book were young scientists who were so gung-ho that they would not listen to the RCTs when they said, back off, you can't take any more radiation. They were so impassioned about winning the war and doing what they had to as quickly as they could. Many of them paid the ultimate price as well.
Do you have a few stories in the book that you'd like to share?
Sure. I'd like to start with one that's kind of a lighthearted one. A lot of them are rather serious, but this is, and I'd love to find out whether anybody knows whether Becky Diven is still alive. She retired to Hawaii, and that was the last contact I had with her, Becky Bradford Diven. So if anyone is listening to this and can identify her, I would love to get a phone call at area code 505-351-4558. And the other person who I'm searching for is a man named Casey Stevens, who lived on 41st Street, who was a brilliant technician and somebody who is also in the book who I can't locate. So if anybody can help me with those two names, I would love it. So here's Becky coming from California. She had developed a very specialized skill when she was working in a laboratory in San Francisco, and that was to create a tiny little scale, a minute little weighing scale, quartz scale. I'm not sure exactly why she learned to do it, but it was a very specialized skill, and the people in Los Alamos needed her because she was coming at a time when plutonium was in these minute little amounts. It's just being produced at the very beginning of the process, and they needed a way to be able to weigh it. So she comes out, and this is her inauguration to the lab. I got off the Super Chief in Santa Fe in a suit. I wanted to make a very good first impression. I had on my high heels, my precious nylons, and a perky little hat with a veil. The WACs came up to me and asked if I was Becky Bradford. They looked at me and just shook their heads. Turned out that these WACs did a little job on the side. Los Alamos had no liquor, so they were doing some rum running. They stopped to get a load prior to picking me up, so they needed to make up some lost time. They chose the old road through San Ildefonso and El Rancho, which was off limits because it was so rough, and the government-issued tires weren't really up to it. So I'm the sole passenger, and it rained and snowed like dogs, and this road was a sea of mud. Welcome to New Mexico. After a while, we got stuck. They looked at me and said, "We'll help you in the front. You drive, and we'll push." "But I don't know how to drive," I said. "I've never driven in my life." They looked at me like I was from Mars. "What do we do now? We have a useless passenger." "Well," I said, "I've never driven a car, but I've pushed one before." "In those clothes?" I took off my nylons and my dainty shoes and put them on the seat. I rolled my skirt up, told them to drive while I pushed. So I did, and we clawed our way out of that muck. They said they needed to make one more unauthorized stop, this time to get me cleaned up before I went for my badge and my dorm assignment. That was my introduction to Los Alamos, and I made two very good friends in the bargain.
Very
And
nice.
she was a delightful person. I mean, I met her in her later years, and she had a sort of a sparkle to her, sort of a bubbly quality that is just, you can, when you listen to the tape, you know, it just brings back this wonderful spirit. And she lived out her life in Los Alamos and was greatly loved here. There's one man that I've singled out. I mean, I must not place favorites, but this guy really was so very special. Gene Westerhold from White Rock has passed away now, about 5 years ago. And Gene did some extraordinary things as a pipe fitter, dealing with spills, all kinds of accidents. He risked his life several times. Amazing person. And this is Gene. Seemed like building 2 was the worst. I remember one time a line salted up, and by that I mean caustic solution in a pipe solidified. It was a 3/4-inch lead pipe, 10 feet long, and we beat on it with hammers, heated it with torches, but it would not free up. So we made up a new section of stainless with flanges on the ends, set up scaffolding, and prepared to change it out. Eddie, my partner, got his end disconnected and plugged it with a stopper, then taped it off. And just as I was to stopper my end, it broke loose and sprayed me with solution, acid laced with plutonium. Well, they got me down fast as I started to feel the burning, got all my clothes and badges off quick, and they went in the trash. They rolled out brown paper in front of me, and I walked through building 2 into building 1 just as naked as a jaybird. Then they threw me in the shower and I started into scrubbing with Vercine and a brush. I did that for a long time. Then they walked me over to the big Geiger counter that would count up to 100,000 millirems a minute, and I couldn't get even near that probe. I read infinity from the soles of my feet on up. Then they ordered 2 health monitors, Henry and Snowball, to get into that shower with me, and they scrubbed until the blood came. The readings held at infinity. Finally, they sent me over to Mady Nunn, an old army nurse. She said she'd grease me down with Vaseline, give me bed sheets and government clothes, and send me home. Time was going to do the rest. Here I was, a 26-year-old boy in a lab coat and wooden clogs, and that nurse looked at me hard and said, "You know, you're just what I've always dreamed of, a nice, clean-cut young man that's hotter than hell." So that's Gene. Gene had a sense of humor despite the fact that he lived a very difficult, and I have to add, really, to just temper this. Gene was one of these people who was the farthest thing in the world from a whistleblower or someone who complained about the laboratory in any way. He was a loyalist from day one, 44 years of service, right? He gets to the end of it, having had terrible exposures like this, many of them. He said, "I just want to see a doctor and see my health records, you know? I want to have some idea of what I'm facing in my retirement and how many years I'm going to be left on this planet." They sent him out a guy who wasn't a doctor. He was in a white coat, and instead of bringing a ream of papers the size of a phone book, they brought one single sheet of paper and sat him down and said, "I don't really see anything on here that's to be concerned about." I mean, it was like a total slap in his face, and it was like he was being treated like he was the enemy because he was asking this, what he felt was the lab's duty to be able to give him some heads up about his future. And it was a very sad and bitter kind of a commentary on the lab's treatment of certain workers who they just could not be straight with.
How was his future? How did his future turn out?
Oh, he died in his mid-70s, maybe, 3 or 4 years later. And I don't know exactly what the causes were, but he didn't last too terribly long. One man who I interviewed in here who had a lot of trouble with discrimination, which was one of the themes that certainly came up from time to time. But he was someone who was very disciplined. He was a metallurgist, and he kept an account every day of what happened on the job. And he also included that the deaths of people who had worked in Sigma building, his building, over the 20-year period that he was there. And he counted 48 people who had died of cancers prematurely in one building. Jeez. So it's like when you run across somebody like that who had the wherewithal to kind of keep their own records when it was so hard for men who were trying to get compensation from the government for their health problems, who either the records have been destroyed or they found it very, very difficult for them to actually acquire the information they needed to be able to present their cases. Someone like him was invaluable. So a lot of sadness and loss attached to, the work.
So when did this book come out?
I just got it from the printer, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3, and I self-published it and spent a lot of money buying 500 copies of it, and I've sold half of them already. I'm thrilled. I mean,
Right.
it's just, I walk down the street in Espanol, I go to the bakery, he wants one, and then I go to the pharmacist, they want a few, the restaurant where I like to have breakfast. It's very, we say Hamish is a Jewish expression, which means very sort of localized and homey, and I hope we get a good turnout tomorrow night, and equally, the first one I had wasn't so great. It was in Taos, book signing, and only 15 people came, and I was expecting, hordes of them. I brought all these books and stuff, but amongst those 15 were a guy named John Nichols. Do you know the name? Mm-hmm. And the fact that I'm preaching there, my book, to the great John Nichols, was like amazing. And I had him on the edge of his seat. I mean, I could tell from his expression and stuff that he was really you see how powerful the stories are. It's just they draw you in, you know, they're so real. And the power of this book is there's never been one written about these folks before, and that it's essentially their words. I'm not putting words in their mouth, you know, I'm just extracting from the interviews their own words. So
where can people find this book?
well, I got here a little early, so I went over to the upstairs at the I'm blocking, you know, your huge building over here with the giant posts.
The county building?
No, the old one, the historic one. Anyway,
Fuller Lodge?
yeah, thank you. I went to Fuller Lodge. I went upstairs looking for this gentleman who's the one who's in charge of book sales at the
History Museum.
At the museum. Thank you. And he wasn't there, but I just left the book. So I will encourage them to carry the book. I've got a few bookstores in Espanola that already have it, but primarily I'm asking people to just call me up and I can either drop off books to them or I can send them. I have two lovely ladies I'm going to after this. Stephanie Sidoriak, who was one of my interviewees, who is alive and well and a wonderful lady in her 90s. And the other is Gloria Guthels, whose husband was an extraordinary person who's since passed. So I can either deliver books to people, and we're working on trying to get on Amazon. We're pulling our hair out because I don't understand how these things work. So I'm begging my friends and neighbors to help me do that. So it's been. I just have to say that, you know, those 5 years, I got an opportunity to knock on doors and meet people that I would never have an opportunity to meet ever in this lifetime. And there was something about the chemistry of, I don't know if you've done any oral history, but when it clicks, the combination of my rapt attention and my honor and singling out people who've never been interviewed before, who've never been kind of had the spotlight turned on them for a few intense hours and stuff like that, and getting back all this incredible wealth of material. It's like a win-win situation. People really, they light up, you know, and it's just a marvelous thing.
It's very exciting, and I congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
I read something about you started a local history museum in Chimayo.
Goes back 1995. I was one of the founders of it. I went around. At that time, I was very interested in collecting archival photographs from people. And it was, again, knocking on doors and you got anything in the attic? You know, we're really trying to dig out the richness of Chimayo history, which is very, very special, and present it to the children, try to get them invested in the great wealth of their history. And little by little, we used those photographs that I collected as the sort of basis for the exhibit, and then we expanded it from there, and now it's in its 20th year, and it's a lovely little museum just on the right next door to Ortega's Weaving Shop, and we're closed at this time of the year, but it's a volunteer effort and some very dedicated people doing it.
That's great. You're not from Chimayo, are you?
I'm from Newark, New Jersey, where I grew up. I went to school up in New England, and I left. I bought an old school bus and fixed it up and got my guitar and some friends and took off, not knowing where I would wind up. And I was a gypsy for a full year. I left several graduate programs. I kept trying to get graduate degrees, and I would be sketching this, you know, my escape route, how I would get out of graduate school and do something adventurous. And it led to the school bus, and I just had the name of a friend living in Chimayo. So at the end of that year of traveling around the country, I wound up there half frozen to death. We had come through some very bitter weather, and I just stayed with her, and that was 46 years ago.
Wow.
And living as a racial minority is a very interesting thing. You know, we're still very much in the minority in Chimayo, and because I don't have children and I'm not religiously inclined, I didn't have the natural networks to be able to kind of connect with people. It came more when after I'd been there for a goodly amount of time. See, I had been an anthropologist before, that's what I was trained in. And I was very sensitive to not wanting to be appeared as someone who was coming in from the outside and trying to extract something from you and then taking it back to the university, to make myself famous. So it took me many years before I felt comfortable enough to start poking my nose into the lives of the old timers who I revered so much in my community, and then other communities like that, just as an insider rather than as an outsider.
Well, it's been very, very interesting talking to you today, but I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. Once again, congratulations on this book. I look forward to reading it. And tell us again about the book signing.
Yeah, book signing is two of them. Tonight is in Espanola, probably a long shot for folks up here. But the one I really wish you would come to is on the 25th, which is a Thursday night at 7 o'clock at the main library. And Katie Korkos has been very gracious in offering me to come up and to do that, and looking forward to meeting some folks from Los Alamos.
Great. Well, I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And thank you for watching the LA Times.